felt like I had been driving for an eternity, certainly much longer than 2 hours. My destination was the Marriott in Baltimore, where Angela was attending some insurance conference. I figured surprising her with dinner might be a nice gesture, but honestly, that wasn't the real reason for my trip. For the last 3 months, something had gnawed at me. A constant, uneasy feeling that every time she went off to these conferences or training sessions, she wasn't exactly working. She had a habit of coming home later than expected, offering vague excuses that never quite added up. Tonight, I was done letting my suspicions eat me alive. I had to find out once and for all if I was imagining things or if my gut instinct was right. After 14 years of marriage and raising 2 incredible kids, Millie, who's 12, and Thomas, who's 10, I couldn't afford to let this doubt linger any longer. The kids were spending the night with my mom, which gave me the perfect opportunity to finally confront Angela and get to the truth. We'd been together since high school, having tied the knot not long after graduation. Back then, Angela was full of life, bright, energetic, and magnetic. With her flowing brown hair and a figure that naturally turned heads, she had always been hard to ignore. But something shifted recently, and not in a small way. Little things about her began to bother me. Small changes that unsettled me deep down. I didn't want to sound like the jealous, paranoid husband, so I kept my suspicions locked away. This time, though, her conference being so close to home gave me the perfect excuse to show up unannounced. When I arrived at the hotel, I handed my suit bag to the front desk and approached the clerk. "Mason Brooks," I said, introducing myself. "My wife, Angela, is at the insurance conference in room 214. She told me I could pick up a key after confirming my identity." The clerk barely hesitated before handing me the key card. I took it, feeling my nerves start to tighten. My mind was racing with questions. What if I actually caught her? How would I react? Should I knock like a decent person, or just walk right in and catch her red-handed? And what if she wasn't alone? Walking down the hallway, I decided there was no point in hesitating. I'd use the key and see the truth for myself. I slid the card into the lock as quietly as possible and pushed the door open. My heart was in my throat as I peeked inside. What I saw completely threw me off. Angela was sitting at the desk, her briefcase wide open, flipping through paperwork. She spun around at the sound of the door, her expression a mix of surprise and confusion. I fumbled for an explanation, quickly telling her I had some free time and thought I'd surprise her with dinner. To my shock, Angela's reaction was far from annoyed. She looked genuinely happy to see me. Her face lit up as she got up, crossed the room, and gave me a kiss. "Why don't you stay the night?" she suggested, her voice upbeat, as though my unexpected visit was the best part of her day. I wasn't prepared for that response. For a moment, I felt like I'd misjudged everything. I tried to lighten the mood with a joke about wanting to steal her away for some time together before dinner. That's when Angela flashed a sly smile. "Why don't we share a quick moment now?" she teased. "And then I'll jump into the shower. Afterward, we can have the whole night to ourselves." For the first time in months, I felt the weight of my paranoia start to lift. Maybe I really had been overthinking things. Maybe my suspicions were just foolish insecurities. We shared an intense, fleeting moment before she disappeared into the bathroom. As the sound of the shower running filled the room, I sank down onto the bed, trying to shake the lingering doubts from my mind as I sat on the edge of the bed, trying to settle my thoughts. My gaze drifted over to Angela's toiletry bag sitting on the dresser. I debated grabbing some aspirin to deal with the pounding headache from the long drive. But when I unzipped the bag, searching for pain relief, what I found instead hit me like a freight train. 6 condoms. I froze, staring at the small box as my brain tried to process what I was looking at. My mind instantly darted back to when Thomas was born. After his birth, Angela had tried birth control pills, but they made her nauseous and miserable, so we agreed I'd get a vasectomy. We hadn't needed any kind of protection since then, not in years. So why the hell were there condoms in her bag? There was no innocent explanation. The reality smacked me in the face all at once. Angela was cheating. A wave of anger and betrayal surged through me, tightening my chest. I sat there, clutching the box, feeling the ground shift beneath me. What now? What was I supposed to do with this? My thoughts spiraled, bouncing between outrage and helplessness, until frustration got the better of me. In a moment I'm far from proud of, I did something petty and vindictive. I rummaged through her bag until I found a safety pin, one of those little ones she always carried in case of wardrobe mishaps. With a dark, bitter determination, I poked tiny holes into the center of each condom, one by one, before carefully sliding the pack back where I found it. The sound of the shower still echoed from the bathroom as I shoved down the rising tide of emotions. I needed to get out of there. I couldn't sit through a night pretending everything was fine when I knew it wasn't. That's when I thought of Owen, my go-to friend, the kind of guy who'd drop everything to help you out, no questions asked. I pulled out my phone and dialed him, keeping my voice low. "I need a favor," I said. "Nothing crazy, just a phone call in an hour. Pretend there's some kind of emergency at the house. A burst pipe at the school, maybe. Something urgent enough that I need to leave." Owen didn't hesitate. "You got it, man. I'll call you at 7. Hanging up the phone, I felt a small sense of relief. The call would be my ticket out, my escape. I couldn't bear the thought of staying the night with Angela after what I just discovered. The idea of sharing a bed with her, pretending to be the doting husband, made my skin crawl. When Angela finally emerged from the bathroom, steam trailing behind her, I could hardly bring myself to look at her. Every part of me wanted to confront her, to shove the evidence in her face and demand the truth. But I held back. Blowing up in anger wouldn't get me answers, it would just make me look like the bad guy. I needed to keep my cool, figure out my next move, and decide how to handle this mess. We made our way downstairs to the hotel's dining room, and I forced myself to act normal, despite feeling like I was breaking apart inside. Angela, completely unaware of the storm raging in me, acted like everything was perfect. It was almost surreal. At the table, I tried to play along. "Order whatever you want," I said casually, forcing a smile. She shrugged, almost indifferent. "I'm not all that hungry," she replied, settling on a small filet mignon. She added a suggestion to share a bottle of rose, as if this was just a romantic dinner with her loving husband. I couldn't resist testing the waters. Leaning back in my chair, I asked her, as casually as I could manage, "Are you happy? With us? Our marriage?" She didn't hesitate, not even for a second. "Of course I am," she said with that same easy smile. "We've got a great life. A beautiful home, 2 wonderful kids, and a husband who loves me. What more could I ask for?" Her words landed like a sucker punch. I forced myself to nod, pretending to agree, but inside, I was reeling. How could she say that? How could she sit there, look me in the eyes, and lie so effortlessly? Was it that easy for her to sneak around behind my back, to play the loving wife while betraying everything we built? I swallowed the lump in my throat and offered a small, hollow laugh. "Sometimes, I wonder if I'm doing enough to make you happy," I admitted, my voice quieter than I'd intended. She reached across the table and gave my hand a soft squeeze, her expression unreadable. "You're a great husband," she said warmly. "I'm lucky to have you." Her words stung, as if she'd twisted the knife even deeper. I nodded again, murmuring that I felt lucky to have her, too. But the truth was, I didn't believe a single word of it anymore. That I even tried to lighten the mood, joking that sometimes I had to pinch myself just to believe our life together was real. Angela let out a laugh and called me a silly goose, her voice filled with a practiced warmth that I now found impossible to trust. She assured me that I had nothing to worry about, that she was happy, content, and glad I had come all this way just to see her. I forced a smile, pretending her words eased the tension gnawing at me, but the weight of what I'd discovered made it impossible to relax. When our meals arrived, we fell into small talk, the kind of idle chatter that fills the silence between people who are pretending everything is normal. I barely registered what she was saying. My thoughts stuck on the box of condoms I'd found and the lingering questions I couldn't shake. Was she lying to my face now? Did she think I was that oblivious? I pushed my food around my plate, hoping to appear engaged, but I was miles away, lost in the mess unraveling inside my head. Then my phone buzzed. Right on time, Owen, the saving grace I'd set up earlier. "Excuse me," I mumbled, standing quickly and stepping into the lobby to answer. I lingered for a few extra minutes, letting the call drag out so it would seem more believable. Owen played his part perfectly, giving me just enough details about the so-called burst pipe to make my excuse plausible. When I returned to the table, I sighed dramatically and told Angela the bad news. That a pipe had burst at the school and I needed to leave right away. I watched her face closely, hoping for some kind of genuine reaction. For a brief moment, her expression faltered, her cheerful demeanor deflating just slightly. She looked annoyed, maybe even a little put out, but certainly not as disappointed as I would have expected if she'd really been happy to see me. Something about that lack of reaction solidified what I already knew. She doesn't care, I thought bitterly. Whether I stayed or left made no real difference to her. Regardless, I knew the reckoning was coming. I wouldn't let her get away with this. As we walked toward the elevator, the moment that unraveled me happened. The doors opened, and out stepped a man I didn't recognize. He spotted Angela immediately, lighting up with a familiarity that made my stomach churn. "Angela!" He greeted her warmly, as though they were old friends. She smiled back, too quickly, too comfortably. He turned to me and extended his hand. "Derek Farrell," he said. "I stopped by your room earlier, but I guess you weren't there." He smiled casually and added, "Angela talks about you all the time. It's great to finally meet you." I shook his hand, forcing what I hoped passed for a polite smile, though it took every ounce of willpower not to squeeze the life out of his fingers. This was him, wasn't it? The man Angela was sneaking around with. I felt like my blood had turned to ice as I stood there, pretending I didn't notice the tension crackling between them. The walk back to the room felt like an eternity. As soon as we got inside, I couldn't hold back anymore. I turned to Angela, my voice firm and low. "I want you to quit your job." Her head snapped toward me, her face hardening immediately. "What?" she shot back, incredulous. "You heard me. I don't want you working with him anymore, Derek. I can't stand the thought of you spending time with that guy." Her eyes narrowed as she crossed her arms, like I was the unreasonable one. "This again? I am not quitting my job. You need to get over your paranoia, Mason. There's nothing going on." She said it so dismissively, so condescendingly, that it made my skin crawl. Somehow, she was turning it all around on me, as though I were the one with the problem, I was the one being irrational. My anger simmered beneath the surface as I looked at her, the woman I had spent half my life with, now acting like I was the enemy. After a cold, perfunctory kiss that felt more like an obligation than affection, I grabbed my bags and left the hotel without another word. I couldn't stand to be there a moment longer. The drive home was a blur. Just me, the hum of the car engine, and my thoughts spinning out of control. I hated her for what she was doing to us, but even more than that, I despised myself for being so powerless to stop it. The image of Derek stepping out of the elevator and greeting Angela like that played on repeat in my mind. By the time I got home, I was a bundle of raw nerves. My thoughts turned to divorce over and over again, but the frustration of not having any concrete proof left me feeling trapped. I knew she was cheating. My gut had been screaming it at me for months, but without something solid to confront her with, what could I do? I felt defeated. 2 days later, Angela returned home from the conference, acting as though nothing had happened. Her bright, cheerful attitude was like nails on a chalkboard, a cruel contrast to the anger boiling inside me. She unpacked her bags with a smile, humming to herself, like she didn't have a care in the world. It was infuriating. How could she pretend everything was fine while I was slowly coming apart at the seams? I couldn't stop myself. The urge to check Angela's bag again was just too strong. When I unzipped it, my heart sank. There it was, one condom left, still punctured with the tiny hole I'd made. Just one. How many had she gone through in only a few days? The thought twisted my stomach, making me feel physically ill. I shoved the bag closed and walked away, the knot in my chest growing tighter with every step. That Saturday, Liberty Insurance, the company Angela worked for, hosted a picnic for employees and their families. The kids were buzzing with excitement, eager to spend the day outside, but I felt nothing but dread. I couldn't shake the suspicion that some of Angela's colleagues knew what was going on. The idea of being whispered about, laughed at, or turned into the subject of smug office gossip made my skin crawl. Maybe I was being paranoid, but after everything I'd uncovered, how could I not be? At the picnic, Angela seemed to be in her element. She floated effortlessly between conversations, laughing and joking like she didn't have a care in the world. And then there was him, Derek. They weren't obvious, nothing anyone could call out directly, but the way they interacted made my blood boil. There was an ease to the way they spoke, a quiet intimacy that no one else seemed to notice. It was as though, in those moments, the rest of the world disappeared for them. I stood off to the side, doing my best to stay invisible, my hands stuffed in my pockets as I watched the charade play out. That's when a woman I didn't recognize approached me. "Hi, I'm Andrea Farrell," she said warmly, extending her hand. Her introduction stunned me, not just because she was Derek's wife, but because she was breathtaking. Long auburn hair cascaded down her shoulders, framing piercing blue eyes that looked like they belonged on a billboard. She was striking, effortlessly elegant, like someone who had stepped straight out of a high-end fashion magazine. For a moment, I couldn't help but think, how could Derek cheat on her? We exchanged polite introductions, but there was a tension beneath the surface, an unspoken understanding that neither of us wanted to acknowledge in public. After a bit of small talk, we decided to find somewhere quieter, away from the noise of the picnic and the eyes of curious onlookers. We wandered over to a pair of benches by the lake, where the sounds of laughter and chatter faded into the distance, leaving only the gentle lapping of water against the shore. Andrea seemed to hesitate, as though she were trying to decide how much to say. Finally, she broke the silence, her voice quiet but steady. I didn't hold back. There was no point in pretending anymore. "I found out this week," I admitted bluntly, "about the affair." Her reaction was immediate relief. The weight she'd been carrying seemed to lift off her shoulders. "I've known for 2 months," she confessed, her tone bitter but resigned. "I've already started the process of filing for divorce. My lawyer hired a private investigator to gather evidence." I stared at her, processing what she was saying. "Evidence?" I asked cautiously. She nodded and explained, her voice firm but tinged with sadness. "Photographs. Recorded phone calls. It's not everything yet, no videos, but it's enough. My lawyer thinks the case is solid." I felt a sick sense of validation. I wasn't crazy. I hadn't imagined any of this. But before I could say anything else, Andrea hit me with a question I wasn't prepared for. "Would you consider using the same evidence in your own divorce case?" I stared at her, momentarily caught off guard. "The same evidence?" I repeated. She nodded, her expression determined. "It'll make your case stronger, too. My lawyer can help you. I want Angela and Derek to face consequences for what they've done. They shouldn't get to walk away unscathed." Andrea wasn't finished. She went on to explain that she planned to sue Liberty Insurance for negligence. Apparently, other employees had come forward to admit they knew about the affair but had chosen to turn a blind eye. "They enabled this," she said bitterly. "They knew what was going on, and they did nothing to stop it. I'm not letting this slide." I listened, her words washing over me as I tried to process everything. Andrea wasn't just planning to walk away. She was going to burn their whole world down. And honestly, I couldn't blame her. Andrea suggested that we pool together any evidence we had, and I agreed without hesitation. Teaming up made sense. We could support each other and build stronger cases. Before I left, she invited me to her house the next morning. Derek would be out golfing for a few hours, she explained, which gave us the perfect window to sit down and go through everything. "I live at 26 Hemlock Avenue in Crest," she added casually, mentioning how it wasn't far. A short drive from where we were. We shared a small, almost embarrassed laugh. "Not exactly a date," I joked, earning a smile from Andrea. But there was something reassuring about knowing someone else was going through the same nightmare I was. I wasn't alone in this. When we returned to the picnic, it seemed like no one even noticed we had been gone. I took a deep breath, feeling a flicker of hope stir inside me. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way out of this mess after all. The next morning, everything fell into place just as I expected. Angela mentioned she was going shopping for a few hours, and I couldn't hide how eager I was for her to leave. The second she pulled out of the driveway, I loaded the kids into the car and dropped them off at my mom's place. Then I headed straight to Andrea's house. When I arrived, Andrea greeted me at the door with her usual calm, composed demeanor. She led me into her den, a cozy room with a plush leather couch and warm, neutral tones. A computer monitor sat on the table in front of the couch, its screen showing an empty motel room. Andrea gestured for me to take a seat and asked if I wanted a drink. I chose a Pepsi, trying to shake off my nerves. "What are we watching?" I asked, glancing at the monitor. Her lips curved into a small, satisfied smile. "Derek playing golf," she said, with just a touch of sarcasm in her tone. "Live and in full color." I stared at her, surprised. "How'd you manage that?" Andrea tilted her head, a glimmer of mischief in her eyes. "Let's just say I know someone who knows someone," she replied. "The caddy, specifically, cost me about $1,400, but something tells me Derek will be the one to pay for it in the end." I couldn't help but chuckle softly, impressed by her resourcefulness. She motioned toward the popcorn and nachos she'd prepared and encouraged me to settle in. "We've got a couple of hours of this," she said lightly, "and you'll leave with a flash drive to take home." There was something about Andrea's confidence that made the situation feel surreal. She admitted that while watching this kind of thing wasn't her idea of fun, she couldn't resist sticking around, at least for the first 20 minutes. As we sat down, she began sharing pieces of the puzzle. Photos, audio recordings, and documents that painted a devastatingly clear picture of Angela and Derek's affair. With each revelation, it became harder to breathe. The depth of their betrayal was staggering. There were phone calls that went on for hours, meetings at hotels scattered across state lines, and even handwritten notes. It was undeniable now. This wasn't a one-time lapse in judgment. It was a full-blown, ongoing relationship. Before long, the monitor flickered to life. I swallowed hard, already bracing myself for what Andrea had promised. And then there they were, Derek and Angela, stepping into the motel room together. They didn't speak, didn't waste a single moment. Clothes were shed almost immediately, and they fell into each other with a familiarity that made my chest tighten painfully. The footage was crystal clear, though the audio came through a little distorted. It didn't matter. I didn't need to hear a thing. Watching my wife like that, with someone else, felt like someone had yanked me out of my own life and thrown me into a nightmare. I couldn't move. It was as if time had slowed down, and I was trapped in that moment, forced to watch a reality I wasn't ready to face. Sensing the weight of what we were witnessing, Andrea tried to lighten the mood. "You've got to admit, you don't see a body like Angela's every day," she quipped dryly, as though her words could soften the blow. I managed a weak smile, but it was hollow. Inside, I was completely numb. The betrayal was too real, too raw. I didn't want to keep watching, but I couldn't tear my eyes away either. It was like staring at the wreckage of my own life, unfolding in real time. After a few more unbearable minutes of watching the footage, I'd had enough. I turned to Andrea and said quietly, "I don't need to see any more of this." She didn't argue. She looked just as drained as I felt. With a heavy sigh, Andrea admitted it was just as hard for her to watch Derek like that. We both agreed to stop the video. There was no point in torturing ourselves further. The lawyers already had more than enough evidence to work with. I let out a shaky breath, trying to gather myself. "It's not just seeing Angela," I confided, my voice low. "It's knowing she's just a room away doing that feels wrong. Everything about this feels wrong." Andrea nodded, her expression softening with genuine understanding. She suggested we step away, do something else to take our minds off things, and for the first time in hours I felt a hint of relief. With a small smile, she told me about her koi ponds in the backyard, her voice lighting up with real enthusiasm. I couldn't help but feel grateful. Anything was better than sitting there, watching my life fall apart on a screen. The backyard turned out to be an unexpected haven. Andrea led me to her koi ponds. 3 of them, each more impressive and tranquil than the last. The water shimmered in the sunlight, teeming with vibrant, colorful fish that moved gracefully through the clear water. As she described the intricate filtration and pumping systems that kept the ponds pristine, I found myself listening intently, genuinely fascinated. With my plumbing background, I couldn't resist offering to help her out if she ever needed it. It wasn't just an excuse to spend time with her. I wasn't looking for anything romantic, but helping someone who deserved it felt right. We spent hours outside, talking about everything except Angela, Derek, and the chaos they'd created. The koi ponds were an oddly therapeutic distraction, and for the first time in a while I felt my mind quiet down. Andrea's calm presence, her light-hearted explanations, made the entire afternoon unexpectedly enjoyable. Eventually, we went back inside, and I glanced at the monitor out of habit. The motel room was empty. Angela and Derek were gone, and I took that as my cue to leave. Andrea walked me to the door, a warm smile on her face. "I'll call you the next time Derek decides to hit the golf course," she promised. Before I left, she invited me to bring Millie and Thomas over sometime to see the ponds. "I think they'd love it," she added. On the drive home, my emotions were all over the place. There was a strange mix of anger, relief, and, for the first time in weeks, a small glimmer of hope. Maybe I wasn't as alone in this mess as I'd thought. The weeks that followed were a blur of quiet turmoil. Every time I stepped into the shower, I found myself sneaking back to Angela's bag, unable to resist checking for condoms. Each time, there was a fresh stash waiting, like clockwork. I couldn't understand how she was using so many or where she was finding the time. It felt like she was leading a double life, one I couldn't access no matter how hard I tried. I kept the safety pin tucked on my keychain, ready for when I found a new box. It was a bitter ritual that only added fuel to the anger burning inside me. On days when Derek had his golf outings, I made a point to take the kids to Andrea's. They adored her almost immediately, dubbing her the Koi Lady in their sweet, playful voices. Millie and Thomas spent hours sitting by the ponds, sketching colorful drawings of the fish and proudly presenting their masterpieces to Andrea. When we got home, they'd run straight to Angela to show off their creations, completely unaware of the irony. It was almost laughable how clueless she was, how she never even questioned where we'd been or who the Koi Lady really was. If anything, Angela seemed relieved that I was keeping the kids occupied, leaving her free to focus on whatever distractions she had lined up. But I wasn't ready to give up. I tried again and again to talk to her about quitting her job, about ending whatever she had with Derek. Each time, Angela met me with the same icy rejection, her face hardening like stone. "I'm not quitting my job," she'd snap, her voice sharp. "You need to get over this, Mason. It's all in your head." It wasn't in my head. I knew what she was doing, and the lies cut deeper every time she denied it. I wanted to scream at her, to make her see the damage she was causing, but I couldn't. Instead, I swallowed my anger and tried to keep my composure, even as it ate me alive. The second conversation with Angela was the worst yet. She went straight for the jugular, tearing apart my masculinity and insinuating that I was the root of all our problems. Her words were sharp, laced with venom, and they hit me harder than I cared to admit. Those exchanges, cold, cutting, and bitter, made it far easier for me to justify everything I was doing. I didn't feel guilty anymore. I began pulling away from her completely. Intimacy became something I actively avoided, making excuse after excuse to stay distant. The less time I spent near her, the more disconnected I became. It was almost like I was fading out of the marriage one day at a time, and honestly, I didn't care. Then, one evening, Angela blindsided me. She dropped a bombshell over dinner, her tone as casual as ever. "I've been feeling really overwhelmed lately," she said, her voice soft and measured, as though she'd been rehearsing. "I think I need to take some time off and visit Heidi. Just a few days, maybe a week." She painted the whole thing as a kind, selfless gesture. "You've been working so hard, overtime, late nights, everything. You need a break too," she said, flashing me a fake smile. This could be good for us both. I'll clear my head, and you'll get a chance to relax. I nodded along, pretending to agree, but inside, my mind was racing. Angela thought she was pulling a fast one, but in reality, she had handed me the perfect opportunity. I barely slept that night, my brain going a mile a minute as I mapped out what needed to be done. The following day, after Angela left for her time away, I wasted no time. The moment she was out the door, I sprang into action. Step 1. I needed to come clean to my parents. I drove straight to their house and told them everything, or at least enough for them to understand. I admitted that I'd failed as a husband, that my marriage was crumbling beyond repair. To my relief, they didn't judge me. They just listened, their support unwavering. My mom promised to look after the kids, and my dad offered his truck. Perfect for moving Angela's things out of the house. The kids were thrilled about spending a few days with their grandparents, blissfully unaware of the storm that was brewing. With that piece in place, I set off on the next step, finding Angela. I had a hunch about where she might have gone. After a grueling 3-hour drive, I hit my first dead end. But I wasn't about to give up that easily. There was still one last place on my list, the family planning center. When I walked through the clinic doors, I made sure to look calm and confident, like I belonged there. I approached the receptionist and flashed a practiced smile. "Hi, I'm Mason Brooks. I'm here to sign some consent forms for my wife, Angela," I said smoothly. She mentioned something about needing a signature to confirm the procedure and agreeing not to pursue any legal action. I just wanted to be sure I signed the right thing. The receptionist gave me a polite nod and started typing into her computer. After a moment, she looked up and said, "Oh yes, Angela Brooks. Your sister-in-law Heidi has already signed, but your signature carries more weight as the spouse." I nodded, trying to look nonchalant, though my heart was pounding. Without hesitation, I picked up the pen and scrawled my name under Heidi's, sealing whatever Angela had set in motion. Before leaving, I casually asked if there was any outstanding balance. The receptionist shook her head, saying, "No, it's all taken care of." She paid the full $800 in cash. That detail stung more than I expected. I thanked her, left the clinic, and climbed back into my car. The strange mix of anxiety and relief bubbling in my chest was hard to process. It felt like everything was finally falling into place, though it still made me sick to my stomach. From there, I drove to Heidi and Brian's house, where Angela was supposedly staying. The second I stepped through the door, the atmosphere in the house turned icy. Angela's eyes widened. Her expression caught somewhere between shock and irritation. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, as though I disrupted some sacred plan. I kept my tone casual, my face calm. "The kids are with my parents for a few days," I said, shrugging. "So I took a little sick leave. Thought I'd come visit. You're always telling me I need to relax, right?" Angela's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. She just stood there, staring at me as if I were an unwelcome guest in her private sanctuary. Inside, I felt a bitter satisfaction. The cracks in her perfect little story were starting to show. The moment I said it, the air in the room seemed to shift. A heavy silence fell, and I could almost see the wheels turning in their heads as they tried to figure out how to respond. Heidi and Brian exchanged a quick, knowing glance before he silently retreated into the kitchen with her, leaving Angela and me alone. She tried to keep the conversation casual, her voice light, but it was clear she was unsettled. I could see it in the way her fingers fidgeted and how she avoided meeting my gaze for too long. Brian reappeared a few minutes later, wearing a forced grin. "Hey," he said, his voice a little too cheery. "Why don't we take Tom's boat out on the lake tomorrow? A little fresh air, some fishing. Good for all of us." I plastered on a smile, pretending the idea was perfect. "Sounds great," I said with fake enthusiasm, even though I knew full well I wouldn't be stepping foot on that boat. The next morning, Tom showed up right on time with the boat, looking ready for a day on the water. Brian was busy packing up, loading the cooler, prepping snacks, and chatting with Tom like everything was fine. But when he turned to me and asked, "You ready to hop in?" I didn't bother beating around the bush. Actually, no, I said flatly, leaning against the truck. I'm not going anywhere. Brian paused, his hands still on the cooler. What do you mean you're not going? Tom's waiting. I shrugged, my tone calm but firm. Changed my mind. I'm not wasting my time with you guys. You should enjoy it, though, because when you get back, you'll have Heidi to deal with. Something tells me she won't be in a great mood. Brian narrowed his eyes, trying to play tough. Don't start, Mason. Just get on the damn boat. You're acting ridiculous. For the next several minutes, he tried everything: reasoning, guilt trips, even a few weak threats. But I wasn't budging. Finally, he realized I wasn't backing down, and with an annoyed huff, he waved Tom over. The two of them left without me, the truck kicking up gravel as they drove off toward the lake. The second they were out of sight, I walked back inside, grabbed myself a cup of coffee, and shut off my phone. I didn't want to deal with anyone, especially Derek, who I figured was trying to get in touch with Angela. Instead, I called my dad. He's an early riser, always up with the sun, and we spent a couple of hours talking about everything and nothing. Felt good to hear his voice, to feel like someone was in my corner. Meanwhile, I ignored the buzzing phone on the counter, letting call after call go unanswered. Brian had probably called Heidi by now, warning her that I hadn't gone with them, but I wasn't about to make any of this easy. Eventually, the house began to stir. Heidi and Angela wandered out of their rooms, clearly groggy and completely unaware of the brewing tension. I ended my call with my dad, took another long sip of coffee, and braced myself for what was coming. Heidi's phone buzzed back to life, and I glanced at the clock. They had about 5 minutes before they were supposed to leave for the family planning center. I casually topped off my mug, brewed a fresh pot for them, and sat back, watching the scene unfold. Angela's irritation hit me like a slap in the face. "What are you still doing here?" she snapped, clearly thrown off. I looked at her calmly, decided I wasn't interested in fishing, figured I'd stick around for the day, spend some time with you guys. Maybe grab lunch somewhere nice before I head out tonight. Angela's eyes hardened instantly. "We already have plans," she said sharply, her voice cutting. "You don't need to tag along. Heidi and I only see each other a couple of times a year, and this is our time." Her attempt to shut me down only fueled my resolve. I stared at her, my voice measured. "I drove all this way, Angela. The least you could do is spare a few hours. It's not that much to ask." Heidi, clearly exasperated, got up and stepped outside to make a phone call. I heard the screen door snap shut, followed moments later by the muffled sound of her voice rising as she laid into Brian. "Why the hell would you leave him behind?" she hissed, her words sharp and clipped. Meanwhile, Angela sat there, looking completely blindsided, like she couldn't believe this was happening. Her composure cracked, if only for a moment, as she stared at me, unsure of how to handle the situation. She made one last attempt to regain control. "Mason, I'm serious. You're intruding. Our plans don't involve you. You should just go." But I wasn't going anywhere. Not this time that I stood my ground, keeping my voice calm and steady as I pushed back. "I'd like to know what your plans are," I said firmly. "That way, I can decide if I want to stick around or find something else to do." Then, with a smirk, I added, "Unless, of course, you're meeting up with some guys?" Angela's eyes narrowed, and she shot back defensively. "Of course not. Don't be ridiculous." She let out a sharp breath, clearly irritated. "We're going shopping for personal things, bras, underwear, nightgowns. Stuff a man wouldn't need to be around for." I shrugged, as though unfazed by her explanation. "That's fine," I replied smoothly. "Most of those stores are at the mall, right? I can easily entertain myself while you shop. In fact, I'll even take you both out for a nice lunch afterward. Call it my way of making up for the inconvenience." Heidi re-entered the room at that moment, her glare practically burning a hole through me. She didn't say a word, but I could tell her earlier phone call had likely been to the family planning center. My gut told me they were trying to reschedule Angela's appointment, hoping to wait me out so they could go once I was gone. But I wasn't about to make this easy for them. "I'll drive my own car," I announced, cutting off any attempt to ditch me. That way, we don't need to worry about splitting up. At the gas station, I dragged out every second of my routine maintenance. I filled the tank at a snail's pace, double-checked the oil, and even wiped down the windshield like I was prepping for a car show. From the corner of my eye, I saw them both sitting in their car, fuming in the passenger seats. Their frustration was palpable, but I took my sweet time, letting the minutes tick by. When we finally arrived at the mall, I parked as far from the entrance as humanly possible, making sure they had a long, drawn-out walk ahead of them. I stayed out of their way, hanging back just enough to let them wander off, but always within sight. It was obvious the entire trip felt forced for them. They picked up a few items here and there, but their whispers and darting glances made it clear they weren't enjoying themselves. They weren't shopping because they wanted to, they were stalling, trying to salvage whatever was left of their original plan. I didn't care about what they bought. The real victory was that I had managed to throw a wrench into their day. The appointment time had come and gone, and I knew Angela would have no choice but to reschedule. While I didn't intend to stop her completely, there was something deeply satisfying about making things just a little more difficult for her. Around noon, we met back in the center court, as planned. I suggested Olive Garden for lunch, and though they didn't seem thrilled, they agreed. The meal was tense. The silence between bites was thick enough to cut with a knife, and the occasional forced comment did nothing to break it. The car ride back to the house was worse. Heidi and Angela sat in brooding silence, both clearly furious with me. But for the first time in weeks, I felt something unexpected, a strange sense of empowerment. For once, I felt like I had the upper hand. When we got back to the house, I grabbed a beer, sank into the couch, and let a quiet satisfaction settle over me. The day hadn't gone how they wanted, and I had made damn sure of that. A couple of hours later, Brian finally returned, only to walk straight into Heidi's wrath. She tore into him the moment he stepped through the door, her voice loud and cutting as she let him have it for leaving me behind. The argument went on for at least 30 minutes, her voice echoing through the house. By the time it was over, Brian looked like a man who wanted to be anywhere else. He vanished into the garage or some other quiet corner, only showing his face again when dinner was ready. That evening, after the dishes had been cleared, I decided it was time to confront Angela. I caught her eye and motioned for her to follow me into the kitchen. "We need to talk," I said quietly. Heidi shot me a look of pure disdain, but to my surprise, she didn't say a word. Instead, she and Angela exchanged a glance before Heidi flopped onto the living room couch, leaving us alone in the kitchen. Angela was still visibly rattled, the day's events clearly wearing on her nerves. She stood stiffly across from me, her arms crossed, her expression guarded. I knew this conversation was going to be anything but easy, but I was ready. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't walking on eggshells. I wasn't wasting any more time. I confronted Angela again, this time leaving no room for avoidance. I repeated my demand that she quit her job and cut all ties with Derek Farrell, my tone even but firm. Her jaw clenched tightly, her eyes flashing with barely contained fury, like she was holding back a storm about to erupt. "Enough!" she snapped, her voice cutting through the tension in the room. "I don't want to hear this again, Mason. I'm done with you pushing me. You already know my answer isn't going to change." She glared at me, her words like venom. "Either you drop this or you leave." But I wasn't backing down. Calmly, I reached for the manila envelope I'd brought with me. I pulled out a thick, legal-sized document and slid it across the table toward her. Inside were the divorce papers. "I've asked you at least 10 times over the past 2 months to quit your job and end things with Derek," I said, my voice steady. "Every time you've refused. I'm done waiting for you to make a decision." I held up a second envelope, a self-addressed, stamped one. "All you need to do is sign them and mail them in. Have a lawyer look them over if you want. It's your choice. But I'm done." Angela's face contorted with fury. She leaned forward across the table, her voice low and seething. "You can't divorce me just because I won't quit my job or stop being friends with someone you don't like." Her tone was dripping with disdain. "You have no grounds for this, Mason. None. I'm still your wife. I'm not going to give up my home or my family because you can't handle my work situation. I paused, letting her words hang in the air for a moment as I carefully chose my response. Then, without saying anything, I reached into the envelope again. I pulled out a small stack of photos and laid them on the table, spreading them out in front of her like a deck of cards. 6 images, each one unmistakable. Angela and Derek in compromising situations. Is this enough grounds for divorce? I asked flatly. For a split second, her face went pale, and I thought she might faint. But instead of guilt or regret, she erupted like a volcano. You've been spying on me? She shrieked, her voice shaking with rage. You're a sneaky, underhanded little creep. Mason. She jabbed a finger toward me, her face twisted with anger. You're a pervert. Is this what you get off on? Watching me, digging through my life like some pathetic stalker? It's disgusting. You make me sick. The irony of her accusations wasn't lost on me, but I didn't take the bait. I let her rant, standing my ground as she hurled insult after insult, her voice rising louder with each word. Just then, my phone rang. I glanced down, my dad. I answered quickly. 10 minutes? Perfect. Thanks, Dad. Angela froze mid-rant, narrowing her eyes suspiciously. Who was that? She demanded, her tone sharp. I looked at her, calm as ever. That was my dad. He'll be here soon with your things. I had him pack everything up and bring it here to Heidi's. It's all taken care of. Her face went red, her fists clenching. What did you just say? I didn't flinch. I've already changed the locks on my house, I explained evenly. If there's anything you've forgotten, let me know and I'll retrieve it for you. I reached back into the envelope and pulled out the title to her car, sliding it across the table. Here, the car's yours. I've already signed it over. Next, I handed her another envelope, this one stuffed with cash. That's half of our joint bank account, $200. I figured it's only fair. Her expression turned from rage to disbelief, but I kept going. You'll have visitation rights with the kids once a week, maybe an overnight stay once a month. I paused, meeting her eyes. But only if you sign a notarized statement admitting to the affair. She stared at me, stunned into silence, but I wasn't done. Oh, and there's a video, I added casually. Scandia Motel, May 10th. 2 hours of footage, covering everything in the photos. Just in case you need a reminder. I calmly gathered the photos back into the envelope, letting her simmer in stunned silence. And no, I didn't take them myself. I'm not interested in what you do, Angela, I said coldly. What I can't stand is the lying, the deception, the betrayal. Finally, I reached into the envelope one last time and pulled out the safety pin I'd carried for weeks. I slid it across the table, the small piece of metal glinting under the kitchen light. You recognize this? I asked. I used it to poke holes in all the condoms you've been using for the past 2 months. Angela's face drained of color completely this time. For once, she didn't have a retort. She just stared at the pin, her mouth slightly open. As if her entire world had just tilted, I looked Angela in the eye, my voice steady as I delivered the final blow. I noticed you went through 48 condoms in just 2 weeks, I said flatly. I didn't think you had it in you. Her face flushed a deep crimson, the words landing harder than anything I'd said before. She blinked rapidly, clearly trying to regain her composure, and then spat. You're a miserable weasel. What you did is the most disgusting, despicable thing I've ever seen. I didn't flinch. No, Angela, I replied calmly, my voice unshaken. The real despicable act was you breaking our marriage vows. I might have been a fool for a long time, but you're the one who destroyed this marriage. I stood up, ready to leave as I heard the rumble of my dad's truck pulling into the driveway. I paused for just a second, looking at her one last time. Not once, I said softly. Have you apologized or shown even a shred of remorse? I started toward the door, but not before offering a final parting shot. Good luck with your procedure on Monday, I said, my tone dripping with false politeness. That's when it finally hit her. For the first time, the tears came big, gasping sobs that shook her shoulders. I didn't turn back. As I walked out, I heard Heidi rushing to her side, murmuring words of comfort, her voice muffled by Angela's cries. Brian followed me onto the porch, his face pale and troubled, clearly grappling with the wreckage of what had just unfolded. "You can't just throw away a 14-year marriage over this," he said finally, his voice almost pleading. I turned to him, leveling him with a look. "Why did Angela come here to see you and Heidi if this was just a misunderstanding?" I challenged. Brian dropped his gaze to the ground, his shoes suddenly far more interesting than the conversation. The silence stretched between us until, finally, he muttered, "I'm sorry, Mason." His voice was low, hollow with guilt. He offered to help unload the truck, and I accepted. Together, we carried Angela's things inside, neither of us speaking. It took no more than 10 minutes, though her cries still echoed faintly from the house. I didn't care why she was crying anymore. It was far too late for that. The following week, the fallout hit Liberty Insurance. Both Angela and Derek were fired, just as Andrea had predicted. Angela flatly refused to sign the affidavit Andrea's lawyer had requested, as if clinging to some small shred of control. It didn't matter. My lawyer reassured me that our case was strong enough without it. After that night at Heidi's, Angela disappeared completely from my life. Not a word. No texts, no calls. She didn't even try to see the kids, though oddly, they seemed unaffected. Instead, they gravitated toward Andrea, bonding with her in a way I hadn't anticipated. I began spending more time at Andrea's place, the kids happily playing by the koi ponds while we sat nearby, watching them. There was no talk of romance between us. Not yet. We were both too focused on navigating the mess of our divorces and doing what was best for our children. Still, there was a quiet comfort in her company. Over the next few months, I found myself learning far more about koi ponds than I ever thought I would. I listened as Andrea explained the details, filtration systems, feeding schedules, even how the fish seemed to have distinct personalities. And strangely, I loved every second of it. Those quiet afternoons brought me a peace I hadn't felt in years. By the time 4 months had passed, both divorces were finalized. Angela didn't fight me. She barely put up any resistance at all. Derek, on the other hand, went down swinging. He lost everything. The house, his investments, and just before Christmas, a crushing alimony payment that would haunt him for years to come. The holidays arrived, and with them, an unexpected visit from Angela. She showed up at our door, arms full of brightly wrapped gifts for the kids. Wearing a smile that looked more like an apology she didn't have the words to say. She played the part of the devoted mother perfectly, sitting with the kids, asking about school, laughing at their stories. I let her do it. I kept my feelings in check, choosing to be polite rather than open old wounds. We didn't talk about the affair, the divorce, or the devastation she'd caused. It was almost as if those painful months had been swept under the rug, erased from the story. After a couple of hours, she quietly slipped away, leaving as suddenly as she'd come. Once the door clicked shut behind her, I stood there for a moment, listening to the silence she left behind. Surprisingly, I didn't feel anger or bitterness. Instead, there was a strange sense of peace. Closure, finally. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe. The house sold quickly, and within a couple of months, I moved in with Andrea. Life was simpler now, freer, like I had shed the weight of my old world. Meanwhile, Derek had somehow managed to land a job in Omaha and, of course, took Angela with him. It wasn't surprising. What was surprising came 4 months later. Derek vanished. No goodbye, no explanation. Just disappeared into thin air, leaving Angela blindsided and alone. With nowhere else to go, she returned to Montana and moved back in with Heidi. As it turned out, Heidi was dealing with her own upheaval. Brian had accepted a position on the Alaskan pipeline and sent Heidi divorce papers through the mail like a coward. The sisters leaned on each other, 2 women trying to patch together lives torn apart by men they once trusted. Angela, abandoned and adrift, was no longer my concern. As for me, life was blossoming. Living with Andrea felt natural, like it had always been meant to happen. Our relationship was easy, comfortable, yet full of purpose. She adored my kids, and they loved her back with all their hearts. The four of us spent our days building a new life, one filled with quiet joy and shared laughter. By June, wedding plans were underway. The scars of our previous marriages had faded, replaced by the anticipation of a fresh start. It felt like life had finally settled into the kind of peace I'd once thought impossible. Derek, however, wasn't so lucky. A few weeks after his mysterious disappearance, news came down the grapevine that he'd been mugged outside one of his favorite bars. The attack was brutal. 5 broken ribs, shattered kneecaps, and teeth knocked out like a boxer in the 10th round. Worst of all, the assailants left him 1 testicle short. They'd stolen his wallet, his dignity, and probably his ability to walk straight ever again. I won't lie, it felt like karma had worked its magic. A man who lived so carelessly, leaving chaos in his wake, finally got his due. Meanwhile, Andrea and I continued to build something real. Our bond wasn't just romantic, it was familial. The kids and I were as immersed in learning about koi ponds as Andrea was in teaching US. Countless afternoons were spent by the water, the sun on our backs as we watched the fish glide effortlessly through their shimmering home. It was peaceful, calm, everything I had wanted for so long but never thought I'd find. Then one day, Andrea surprised me with news that left me stunned. "I bought something," she said, her eyes alight with excitement. "What kind of something?" I asked, curious. She grinned and handed me the address to a beautiful 6-bedroom villa just a few miles away. She had purchased it with the savings she'd accumulated before selling her business. When she showed me photos, I could hardly believe it. It had everything: a sprawling backyard, a massive swimming pool, and enough space for all of us to grow into a true family. But Andrea wasn't done yet. With a mischievous smile, she took me to the garage and swung open the doors. There, gleaming like a memory brought back to life, was my old Chevrolet Corvette. I hadn't seen it in years. I'd assumed it was long gone. "I knew you'd want it," she said softly. "It's been waiting for you." Seeing that car again felt like reconnecting with a piece of myself I thought I'd lost forever. Andrea had kept it safe, hidden away, as a reminder of happier times. "We're taking it for a drive soon," she promised. "And afterward, we'll celebrate at that French place we love." It was perfect. The thought of Andrea, me, and the Corvette taking a long, scenic drive down the coast felt symbolic. 3 companions on a new journey, leaving the past in the rearview mirror. And as for Angela, the last I heard, she was still holed up at Heidi's, trying to scrape together the pieces of her life after Derek's betrayal. It wasn't my problem anymore. I had moved on. Fully. Completely. I was no longer haunted by the chaos and betrayal that had nearly broken me. Now, I stood at the threshold of a new chapter, with Andrea by my side, my kids thriving, and a future filled with possibilities. We had earned this happiness, every bit of it.